She was the last child of Queen Victoria. Her life was a prison sentence. Meet Princess Beatrice, the woman born into the world's most gilded cage. She wasn't just a daughter. She was a royal hostage, permanently held captive to comfort her tyrannical, grieving mother. She fought for her freedom. She won her love, Prince Henry of Battenberg. But fate took a devastating revenge. 10 years later, she watched her husband sail to Africa and perish from malaria, leaving her a widow, chained back to her mother's side until death. This is the ultimate bi-directional tragedy of duty. The princess who was first killed by solitude, then killed again by grief. This is the untold story of the cost of the crown. On April 14, 1857, at Buckingham Palace, Queen Victoria gave birth to her 9th and final child, a daughter named Beatrice Mary Victoria Feodore. For the Queen, who famously disliked pregnancy and the newborn stage, this birth was a relief. She affectionately called the infant Baby, a nickname that would cling to her for decades, long after she had children of her own. Little did anyone know how profoundly that simple, endearing term would define her entire existence. Beatrice's early years were spent in the vibrant, bustling, and idyllic bubble of the Victorian royal family, meticulously crafted by her parents, Queen Victoria and the brilliant, forward-thinking Prince Albert. The royal children, though undeniably privileged, were raised with a strong sense of discipline, duty, and intellectual curiosity. They had their own Swiss cottage at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, where they learned practical skills like gardening and carpentry. It was an environment designed by Albert to create a model family, blending the grandeur of monarchy with the wholesome virtues of the middle class. Beatrice, being the youngest, was doted on by her parents and adored by her 8 older siblings. Early photographs show a cherubic child with large, expressive eyes, the beloved final addition to a seemingly perfect family portrait. But this idyllic world, the only world Beatrice had ever known, was about to be shattered in a way that would irrevocably shape her destiny. In December 1861, when Beatrice was just 4.5 years old, Prince Albert died of typhoid fever. The national grief was immense, but the private grief within the walls of Windsor Castle was a cataclysm. Queen Victoria, utterly devastated, plunged into a state of profound, unending mourning that would last for the rest of her life. The vibrant colors of the court were replaced with stark black. Laughter was supplanted by a heavy, reverent silence. The queen of a global empire retreated from public view, becoming the widow of Windsor, a near-mythical figure cloistered away with her sorrow. This was the atmosphere that defined Beatrice's childhood. While her older siblings had years of memories of their brilliant, loving father and a happy, vibrant mother, Beatrice's formative years were spent navigating the silent, grief-stricken quarters of palaces that now felt more like mausoleums. Her mother, once the center of a lively family, was now a remote black-clad figure, her emotional world entirely consumed by the memory of her beloved Albert. Beatrice's primary role from a very young age became to soothe, to comfort, and to simply be present for her inconsolable mother. She was the one remaining piece of her nursery days that Victoria could cling to, the last vestige of that perfect family Albert had built. There's a heartbreakingly prophetic story from when Beatrice was just 5 years old, watching her older sister, Princess Alice, prepare for her wedding to Prince Louis of Hesse. The little girl is said to have declared firmly, "I don't like weddings. I shall never be married. I shall stay with Mama." A child's innocent pronouncement, perhaps, born from a desire not to see another loved one leave. But for Queen Victoria, it was a lifeline. She latched on to those words, repeating them in her journals and letters. This wasn't just a daughter's sweet sentiment. It was an unspoken pact. In the Queen's mind, Beatrix's destiny was now set. She would be her mother's companion, her comfort, her baby forever. The cage, though lovingly gilded, was already being constructed. As Beatrix grew from a child into an adolescent, the unspoken pact solidified into the central reality of her life. While her siblings, one by one, fulfilled their royal destinies by marrying into the great houses of Europe, Beatrix remained. Each wedding, each departure, was another turn of the key in the lock of her own gilded cage. When Princess Helena married, then Louise, then Arthur, each farewell tightened the Queen's grip on her youngest. The departures were a constant source of anxiety for Victoria, who saw them as a form of abandonment. But with each one, Beatrix's value as the steadfast, immovable anchor in the Queen's life grew exponentially. Her education was tailored to this role. She was bright and artistically gifted, showing remarkable talent as a pianist. She was even a favored pupil of the famed pianist Sir Charles Halley and a skilled watercolorist and photographer. Yet her education was not geared towards preparing her for a public role or her own court as her sisters had been. It was designed to make her the perfect companion. She became fluent in German and French, not for diplomatic purposes, but so she could converse with the Queen's European relatives and read foreign correspondence aloud. Her days were structured around her mother's needs. The morning would begin with helping the Queen with her letters. The afternoons would involve reading aloud, novels, reports, state papers. The evenings were for music, quiet conversation, and providing the constant, reassuring presence her mother craved. It was a life of immense intimacy with the monarch, but also one of profound isolation. She had few friends her own age. Her interactions were almost exclusively with her mother, older ladies-in-waiting, and visiting dignitaries. She was at the very heart of the British Empire, yet her own world was incredibly small, confined to the royal residences of Windsor, Balmoral, and Osborne. She was privy to state secrets and the Queen's innermost thoughts, yet she was denied the simple freedom of a young woman her age, the freedom to forge her own path, to have her own friends, to fall in love. Her elder siblings, particularly the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, and her sister Alice, grew increasingly concerned. They saw their youngest sister's life being slowly suffocated. They attempted to intervene, suggesting that Beatrix should be allowed to attend balls and social events with them in London, but the Queen would have none of it. She viewed these suggestions as a betrayal, an attempt to steal her precious baby from her. Any mention of a potential suitor for Beatrix was met with glacial disapproval and prolonged punishing silence from the Queen. Victoria's journals from this period are filled with entries expressing her horror at the thought of Beatrix ever leading her. She wrote of how Beatrix was an agreeable, pretty, and amusing companion, and how the very idea of losing her was too dreadful to think of. This wasn't just a mother's love. It was a desperate, almost pathological dependency. The Queen had fused her own identity so completely with that of a grieving widow that she required Beatrix to be the permanent supporting character in her lifelong drama of sorrow. For Beatrix, a naturally dutiful and affectionate daughter, resisting would have been unthinkable. It would have meant causing immense pain to the mother she loved, the sovereign she served, and the lonely woman she had spent her entire life trying to comfort. So she acquiesced, suppressing her own youthful desires and resigning herself to a life of quiet service.
She was the Queen's shadow, her confidant, her secretary, her hands and eyes. But she was ceasing to be her own person. Yet, even in this constrained existence, the human heart finds a way to dream. And for a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed as though fate might offer Beatrice an escape. In the late 1870s, a dashing and tragic figure entered her orbit. Napoleon, the Prince Imperial of France, the only child of the exiled Emperor Napoleon III and Empress Eugenie. He was living in England and had become a favorite of Queen Victoria. He and Beatrice formed a close, warm friendship. There was a spark, a connection that everyone at court noticed. The Empress Eugenie was hopeful for a match, and even Queen Victoria for once seemed to consider the possibility. A marriage to the Prince Imperial might have been the one union she could accept, as his exiled status meant he would likely remain in England, close by her side. For Beatrice, it must have felt like the first real possibility of a future that was hers, a life with a handsome, brave young man she genuinely cared for, a life that combined love with her duty. But this glimmer of hope was to be cruelly extinguished. In 1879, seeking military glory, the Prince Imperial joined the British forces in the Anglo-Zulu War in South Africa on a reconnaissance mission. His party was ambushed, and he was tragically killed. He was just 23 years old. The news was a devastating blow to the court, and especially to Beatrice. Her first and perhaps only real prospect of love and a life of her own had been snatched away by a Zulu spear on a distant continent. The door to a different future had been slammed shut. After the Prince Imperial's death, Queen Victoria's resolve hardened. She would never again risk losing her daughter to the unpredictability of love and fate. The unspoken pact was now sealed in tragedy. Beatrice's fate, it seemed, was to remain a spinster princess forever by her mother's side. The court and Beatrice herself began to accept this as an unchangeable fact. Little did they know, a family of handsome German princes was about to arrive in England, and one of them was destined to challenge everything. The year is 1884. Princess Beatrice is now 27 years old. To the outside world, and even to those within the inner circle of the court, her fate appears sealed. She is the quiet, artistic, and unfailingly beautiful daughter of the Queen Empress. Her days are a metronomic routine of service to her mother, reading correspondence, writing letters, providing the gentle companionship that Victoria so desperately craved. The brief, tragic flame of a potential romance with the Prince Imperial had been extinguished 5 years prior, and with its demise, any hope for a different life seemed to have died as well. Beatrice had settled into a state of quiet resignation, finding solace in her music, her art, and the steadfast love she held for her formidable mother. She was, for all intents and purposes, an honorary spinster, the permanent fixture at the Queen's side. But history and the human heart are rarely so predictable. The catalyst for change came not from a grand political maneuver, but from a family celebration. In April 1884, Beatrice's niece, Princess Victoria of Hesse, and by right, daughter of her late beloved sister Alice, was to be married in Darmstadt. Queen Victoria, still strictly avoiding such public festivities, dispatched Beatrice to represent her. For Beatrice, it was a rare trip away from her mother's immediate orbit, a brief sojourn into the wider world of European royalty. It was there, amidst the pageantry and celebration, that destiny intervened. The groom was Prince Louis of Battenberg, and attending the wedding were his 2 younger brothers, Alexander, the celebrated Prince of Bulgaria, and the youngest, the charming, handsome, and vivacious Prince Henry. Known to his family as Leo, Prince Henry of Battenberg was everything the Victorian court was not.
He was dashing, witty, and possessed an easy continental charm. The Battenbergs were a handsome family, but they came from a morganatic marriage, a union between a prince of a reigning house and a woman of lower rank. This meant that while they had princely titles, they were not considered on the same level as the great royal houses of Europe and had to make their own way in the world. Henry was serving in the Prussian army, a man of action with a bright future ahead of him. When he was introduced to the shy, reserved English princess, the effect was immediate and electric. It was what the French call a coup de foudre, a thunderbolt of love at first sight. For Beatrice, who had spent her entire adult life in the muted, somber twilight of her mother's court, Henry's vibrant personality must have felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. He saw past the timid companion to the Queen and saw a beautiful, intelligent woman with a gentle wit and a deep capacity for affection. They talked, they laughed, and in the stolen moments of that wedding celebration, they fell deeply and irrevocably in love. For the first time in her life, Beatrice was the sole focus of a man's affectionate attention, and the feeling was overwhelming. She had found the one thing she believed she would never have. Returning to England, Beatrice was a changed woman. She carried with her a secret that was both thrilling and terrifying. She and Henry began a discreet correspondence, their feelings deepening with every letter. But they both knew the colossal obstacle that stood in their way: Queen Victoria. How could Beatrice, who had once declared she would never marry, possibly break the news to the mother, whose entire emotional equilibrium seemed to depend on her constant presence? The thought was paralyzing. She knew her mother's reaction would be not just one of disappointment, but of profound, gut-wrenching betrayal. For months, Beatrice carried her secret, her heart torn between her newfound love for Henry and her lifelong devotion to her mother. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she confessed. The reaction was everything she had feared, and more. Queen Victoria did not rage or shout or argue. She did something far more devastating. She fell into a glacial, terrifying silence. For 7 months, the Queen did not speak to her youngest daughter. She communicated with her only through notes, her displeasure a palpable, suffocating presence in the royal apartments. The court was plunged into a state of tense misery. Ladies-in-waiting and government ministers alike tiptoed around the silent, bitter war being waged between the Queen and her once favorite child. In her journal, Victoria poured out her sense of betrayal and fury. Heard from Beatrice from Darmstadt of her wish to marry Prince Henry of Battenberg, she wrote, her pen practically dripping with indignation, was greatly startled and feel it deeply. The shock, the horror, the distress this has caused me are indescribable. To the Queen, this was not a daughter finding happiness. It was the ultimate act of abandonment. She saw Henry not as a suitor, but as an enemy, a Battenberg buck who was trying to steal her most precious possession. She refused to even consider the match, forbidding it outright. The stalemate was agonizing. Beatrice, though heartbroken by her mother's reaction, held firm.
the quiet, dutiful daughter had discovered a steely resolve she never knew she possessed.
She was in love, and for the first time, she was willing to fight for her own happiness. The rest of the royal family, who had long worried about Beatrix's cloistered existence, cautiously rallied to her side. The Prince and Princess of Wales, Bertie and Alex, acted as mediators, gently trying to reason with the implacable queen. They spoke of Beatrix's years of unwavering devotion, arguing that she had more than earned a right to a life and a family of her own. The turning point came when they presented the queen with a proposal so extraordinary, it was the only thing that could possibly appease her. Prince Henry, so deeply in love with Beatrix, was willing to make a sacrifice almost unheard of for a prince of his standing. He would agree to renounce his military career in Prussia, give up his German commitments, and make his permanent home in England. More than that, he and Beatrix would live with the queen, continuing to be her companions and assistants. He was not asking to take Beatrice away. He was asking to join her in her gilded cage. This was the masterstroke. Victoria, faced with the unshakable determination of her daughter and a proposal that allowed her to keep Beatrix by her side, finally, grudgingly began to thaw. She could have her daughter's happiness, but on her own terms. She would not lose her baby. She would simply gain a son-in-law, one who would be contractually bound to her household. She gave her consent. The 7-month silence was broken, and plans for a wedding were made. On July the 23rd, 1885, Princess Beatrix and Prince Henry of Battenberg were married at St. Mildred's Church in Whippingham, a small church near Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. It was a comparatively intimate affair, deliberately staged to be the Queen's domain. The public celebrated enthusiastically, overjoyed that the nation's baby had finally found love. For Beatrice, it was the happiest day of her life. She was radiant. She had defied the odds and won her right to be a wife. As she walked down the aisle, she was symbolically supported by her mother and her eldest brother, the Prince of Wales, a visual representation of the family pact that had been forged. Their married life began just as promised, under the constant watchful eye of Queen Victoria. They were given apartments at Windsor Castle and Osborne Cottage, a stone's throw from the Queen's main residence. Their honeymoon was cut short by the Queen's insistence that they join her at Balmoral. From the very beginning, it was clear that their life would not be their own. Beatrix's duties continued, now with Henry in tow. He would accompany the Queen on her drives, dine with her every night, and make polite conversation. He brought a welcome breath of fresh air and charm to the stuffy, aging court. The Queen grew genuinely fond of her handsome, amiable son-in-law, calling him Leo, and appreciated his cheerful presence. For a time, they were happy. Beatrice was transformed by marriage and motherhood. Over the next few years, she gave birth to 4 children: Alexander, called Dro, in 1886, Victoria Eugenie, or Ina, in 1887, and 2 more sons, Leopold in 1889 and Maurice in 1891. She adored being a mother, and the royal nurseries were once again filled with the sounds of children. To the Queen's great delight, Beatrice had managed to achieve the impossible. She had a loving husband and a beautiful family, all without ever leaving her mother's side. But this unique arrangement came at a cost, and that cost was borne almost entirely by Prince Henry. He was a soldier, an active and ambitious man, and he found his new role as a permanent courtier to be stiflingly dull. His official title was His Royal Highness Prince Henry of Battenberg, but his role was ill-defined. The Queen appointed him governor of the Isle of Wight in Carisbrooke Castle, a prestigious title once held by Prince Albert, but its duties were largely ceremonial. He was denied any significant military or political role, much to the frustration of both Henry and the Prince of Wales, who believed his talents were being wasted. He was, in essence, a high-ranking companion, expected to be perpetually available and perpetually cheerful. The boredom was at times excruciating. He once famously quipped to a friend, "I am not allowed to do anything but eat and drink and sleep." An additional shadow fell upon their family happiness with the discovery that hemophilia, the so-called royal disease, had been passed through Beatrice to her children. Her second son, Leopold, was diagnosed as a hemophiliac, a fragile child who required constant care and lived under the threat of a fatal bleed. Her daughter, Victoria Eugenie, was a carrier of the gene, a fact that would have catastrophic consequences for the Spanish royal line, while her youngest son, Maurice, was unaffected. This genetic curse, which had already brought tragedy to her sister Alice's family, was a source of constant gnawing anxiety for Beatrice, a private sorrow she bore with quiet fortitude. As the years went by, Henry's restlessness grew. He loved Beatrice and his children dearly, but the gilded cage was beginning to feel more and more like a prison. He longed for action, for purpose, for a chance to prove his worth beyond the confines of the court. He began to look for opportunities abroad, for a way to participate in the great imperial project of his mother-in-law's empire. He pleaded with the queen to let him take on more meaningful military appointments, but she consistently refused, terrified of any risk to his safety, which would in turn devastate Beatrice and disrupt her own carefully constructed world. Henry's gaze, however, continued to drift towards the distant drums of colonial campaigns. He read the dispatches from Africa and India with a growing sense of frustration and yearning. He was a prince and a soldier, and he desperately wanted to live like one. This deep-seated need for purpose would soon lead him to make a fateful request, one that would ultimately shatter the happy family life he and Beatrice had fought so hard to build. The early 1890s found Princess Beatrice and Prince Henry of Battenberg in a state of settled, if complex, domesticity. To the outside world, they were a model couple. Beatrice, once the shy, retiring princess, had blossomed as a wife and mother. Her 4 children, Dro, Ina, Leopold, and Maurice, were her world, and her love for her husband Leo was the anchor of her life. They had successfully navigated the treacherous currents of Queen Victoria's possessiveness to build a warm and loving family, all within the gilded confines of the court. But beneath this placid surface, a powerful and dangerous current was gathering strength. Prince Henry's profound and growing sense of purposelessness. He had honored his promise. For nearly a decade, he had been the consummate son-in-law, charming, attentive, and ever-present. He had accepted the ceremonial duties, the endless dinners, the role of a decorative escort to his wife and his mother-in-law. But this life was a gilded cage, and Henry was beginning to rattle the bars. He was a soldier by training and temperament, a man of action reduced to a life of enforced leisure. The idleness was more than just boring. It was corrosive to his spirit, a constant reminder that he had surrendered his autonomy for the woman he loved. His friends and his brother-in-law, the Prince of Wales, saw his frustration and sympathized. They knew a man of his caliber was being wasted, his talents slowly atrophying in the stuffy, claustrophobic atmosphere of the aging queen's court. Henry began to actively seek out a role, any role that would give him a sense of worth. He undertook a sea voyage to Corsica and the Mediterranean, a brief taste of freedom that only sharpened his appetite for more. He pleaded with the queen for a meaningful military command or a colonial governorship, but his requests were always gently but firmly denied. Victoria had grown deeply fond of him, and she could not bear the thought of him being in any danger. Her refusal was born of affection, but for Henry, it felt like a life sentence. The breaking point came in 1895. News had reached Britain of instability in the Ashanti Kingdom in West Africa, a region that would later become part of Ghana. The British government, in a classic display of late Victorian imperialism, decided to mount a punitive expedition to depose the Ashanti king, Prempeh I, and annex the territory. For the board quarters and ambitious officers of the British Army, it was the latest small war of the empire, a chance to win medals and glory. For Prince Henry, it was a lifeline. Here was his chance, a real military campaign where he could serve as a soldier, not a royal ornament. He immediately volunteered to serve on the staff of the expedition's commander, Sir Francis Scott. When the Queen found out, her reaction was one of absolute horror. The Gold Coast was notoriously known as the white man's grave. The true enemy in this campaign would not be the Ashanti warriors, but the punishing climate and rampant tropical diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery. For Victoria, who had already lost a husband, a daughter, and 2 grandchildren, the thought of sending Henry into such a perilous environment was unendurable. She forbade it categorically. But this time, Henry would not be denied. His desperation had given him a new resolve. He launched a relentless campaign of persuasion. He argued that it was his duty as a soldier. He enlisted powerful allies, including the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Cambridge, the commander-in-chief of the forces, who both supported his desire for active service. But his most crucial and most complex ally was Beatrice herself. She was torn. The thought of her husband going into danger terrified her, but she had also witnessed his spirit slowly dimming over the years. She loved him too much to see him so unhappy. In a profound act of selfless love, she supported his plea, choosing her husband's happiness over her own peace of mind.
Faced with Henry's unshakable determination and the reluctant support of her own daughter, the queen finally, tearfully relented. Her consent was a heartbreak. She made Henry promise that he would take no unnecessary risks, that he would be careful, that he would come home. On December 6, 1895, the farewells were said at Windsor Castle. Beatrice, putting on a brave face for her husband and her children, accompanied him to the station. It was a cold, gray day, a grim reflection of the fear in her heart. As the train pulled away, carrying her beloved Leo towards the coast and on to Africa, she could not have known that she was seeing him alive for the last time. Henry's initial letters home were filled with the excitement and novelty of the campaign. He was finally free, finally doing the work he was born to do. He described the voyage, the other officers, the exotic sights and sounds of the African coast. For the first few weeks, everything went according to plan. The expeditionary force marched inland towards the Ashanti capital, Kumasi, facing little military resistance. The real battle, however, was already being waged on a microscopic level. The humid, swampy environment was a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and the British forces, with their heavy wool uniforms and limited understanding of tropical medicine, were tragically vulnerable. Men began to fall ill, not from wounds, but from fever. The sick list grew longer each day. And then the inevitable happened. Prince Henry, who had thrown himself into his duties with vigor, contracted malaria, known then as coast fever. It was a swift and brutal illness. He was immediately struck down by debilitating chills, a raging fever, and crippling weakness.
He was moved to a field hospital where he was tended to by the expedition's doctors, but his condition worsened. The commander, Sir Francis Scott, made the difficult decision to send him back to the coast in the hope that the sea air might help him recover. He was carried in a hammock for days through the dense jungle, a grueling journey that further depleted his strength. Back in England, Beatrice waited anxiously for news. Telegrams were slow and infrequent. She received a message that Henry had a fever but was doing well, a standard reassuring phrase designed to prevent panic, but it did little to calm her fears. The Queen, too, was beside herself with worry, her days spent waiting for the dreaded arrival of the telegram boy. By the time Henry reached the coast, he was critically ill. He was transferred to the hospital ship HMS Blonde, which was ordered to sail for the healthier climate of Madeira, but it was too late. The fever had taken too great a toll on his body. On January 20th, 1896, while the ship was anchored off the coast of Sierra Leone, His Royal Highness Prince Henry of Battenberg died. He was just 38 years old. His last whispered words were reportedly a message for his wife. The news was sent back to England via cable from Madeira. On the afternoon of January 22nd, a telegram arrived at Osborne House. Queen Victoria was summoned to read it. The message was stark and brutal. Prince Henry had died at sea 2 days earlier. The Queen's first thought was for her daughter. She had to be the one to tell her. She found Beatrice, who had just come in from a walk and was preparing to have tea with her. Victoria, her own heart breaking, took her daughter's hands and delivered the catastrophic news. Beatrice's world collapsed. Her reaction was one of utter, silent devastation. As the Queen later wrote in her journal, the terrible reality was and is untold. Beatrice simply sat and stared and said nothing. The brief sunlit chapter of her life was over. The grief that enveloped Beatrice was absolute. It was not the performative public mourning of her mother, but a quiet internal shattering. In the space of a single telegram, she had been transformed from a happy wife into a widow, from the mother of a complete family into a single parent to 4 fatherless children. Her one great love, the man for whom she had defied her mother and who had brought such light into her constrained life, was gone. The nation mourned with her. The return of Prince Henry's body was a somber national event. His coffin, draped in the Union Jack, was brought back to the Isle of Wight. The funeral was held on February 5, 1896, at St. Mildred's Church in Whippingham, the very same village church where he and Beatrice had been so joyfully married just over a decade before. Now she followed his coffin down the same aisle, a black-clad figure, her face hidden by a heavy veil. She was 38 years old, the same age her mother had been when Prince Albert died. This shared tragedy forged a new, unbreakable bond between mother and daughter. They were now united in the somber sisterhood of widowhood. Queen Victoria, who knew the depths of this particular grief better than anyone, poured out her love and support for her devastated daughter. But this comfort came with a terrible unspoken finality. The cage door, which had opened just enough for 10 years to let the sunshine in, was now slammed shut, bolted, and locked forever. Beatrice would never leave her mother's side. Now her duty, which had once been a matter of filial devotion, was now also a matter of shared sorrow. Beatrice retreated into her grief.
shunning society and dedicating herself entirely to her children and her mother. She appointed herself the guardian of her husband's memory, just as Victoria had done for Albert. She established the Prince Henry of Battenberg Memorial Chapel within Whippingham Church, ensuring his final resting place was a site of pilgrimage and remembrance.
She took on his now vacant role as governor of the Isle of Wight, a public display of her commitment to continuing his legacy. Her life once again revolved entirely around Queen Victoria. She resumed her role as unofficial secretary and companion, but the dynamic had changed. Before, she had been the beautiful daughter. Now she was the widowed companion, her own life and hopes for the future, sacrificed on the altars of both love and duty. The tragedy of Prince Henry's death had not freed her. It had bound her more tightly than ever to her mother, trapping her in a state of perpetual mourning and service that would last until the Queen's own death. The final chapter of her life with her mother was about to begin, a twilight era defined by loss, memory, and an unbreakable tragic bond. The death of Prince Henry of Battenberg in the jungles of West Africa did not just create one widow. In a sense, it created two. While Beatrice was plunged into the raw, shocking grief of a young wife, her mother, Queen Victoria, re-entered a state of mourning that was painfully familiar. The Queen, now in her late 70s, had outlived her beloved husband, 3 of her children, and numerous grandchildren. Loss was the grim, constant companion of her long life. The death of her charming, vibrant son-in-law was another deep wound, but it was also a catalyst. It forged a new, unbreakable, and profoundly tragic bond between mother and daughter. They were no longer just sovereign and subject, or mother and child. They were partners in sorrow, the 2 final widows of Windsor. The final 5 years of the Victorian era, from 1896 to 1901, were a period of quiet, somber routine for Beatrice. Her life, which had been briefly illuminated by the joy of her own family, now reverted to its original purpose, but with a new and heavier gravity. She was once again her mother's shadow, but now her shadow was tinged with its own darkness. Her days were a metronome of duty. She would read the state papers to the aging queen, whose eyesight was failing. She would manage her correspondence, her gentle presence a constant soothing balm for the elderly monarch. The court, already staid and formal, became even more so, dominated by these 2 black-clad women, one mourning a husband lost decades ago, the other a husband lost just yesterday. Beatrice's own grief was a quiet, private affair. Unlike her mother, she did not perform her sorrow for the world. She retreated inward, focusing her emotional energy on her 4 children. They were now the sole bright focus of her world. Raising them alone was a daunting task, made all the more so by the dark genetic shadow that hung over her family. Her sons, Leopold and Maurice, were both hemophiliacs, a constant source of terror for a mother who had already lost so much. Every fall, every bruise, held the potential for tragedy. This private anxiety, which she bore with immense fortitude, added another layer of sorrow to her already burdened heart. She was determined to give them a happy, secure childhood, a fortress of maternal love to protect them from the harsh realities of their condition and their father's absence. In a surprising move for the notoriously private princess, she took on a public role as a way of honoring her late husband. She petitioned her mother and was granted the governorship of the Isle of Wight, the post Henry had held. It was more than a ceremonial title for her. It became her mission, a tangible link to Leo's memory. She took the duty seriously, involving herself in the life of the island, opening civic buildings and supporting local charities. It was the first time she had ever truly stepped into the spotlight on her own terms, and it revealed a capable and dignified woman who had been hidden behind the throne for so long. This role gave her a purpose outside of her mother, a small domain where she was not just baby, but the governor. But even as she navigated her own life as a widow and mother, a new monumental task was looming, one that would come to define the rest of her life. Queen Victoria, acutely aware of her own mortality, was beginning to put her legacy in order. Her most private and most voluminous creation was her personal journal. Since the age of 13, she had documented her life with meticulous and often brutally honest detail. By the end of her life, the journal consisted of 122 handwritten volumes. They were an unparalleled historical record, containing her innermost thoughts on everything from state secrets and political crisis to her frank and frequently unflattering opinions of her ministers, her family, and the world around her. Victoria knew that this raw, unfiltered account of her life was historical dynamite. It could not be left to posterity in its current form,
and so she entrusted the task of editing it to the one person she knew she could rely on absolutely, Beatrice. The instructions were simple, yet carried immense weight. Beatrice was to transcribe the journals, and in the process she was to edit them, removing anything that might be considered too personal or that could give offense or pain to living people. It was a staggering undertaking, and it began even before the Queen's death. Day after day, Beatrice would sit for hours, painstakingly deciphering her mother's spidery handwriting and copying the text into a series of blue notebooks. After a section was transcribed and edited, she would read her version aloud to the Queen for approval. Once approved, under the Queen's watchful eye, Beatrice would perform the final irrevocable act. She would burn the original volume page by page. This act of destruction has become one of the most controversial aspects of Beatrice's life. To historians, it is an act of cultural vandalism on an epic scale. The unfiltered thoughts of one of the most influential figures in modern history were systematically destroyed, replaced by a sanitized, approved version. The question that has haunted historians ever since is, what was removed and why? Some argue that Beatrice was simply being the dutiful daughter carrying out her mother's explicit wishes to the letter. In this view, she was protecting her mother's privacy, curating her image exactly as Victoria herself would have wanted. Others believe she was acting as a family censor, protecting the reputation of the monarchy. Did she remove the Queen's harsher criticisms of her children? Did she excise politically sensitive comments that might embarrass the government or the royal family? It's almost certain that she did. She was above all a product of her environment, and the need to maintain the dignity and mystique of the crown would have been ingrained in her. There was also the possibility of a more personal motive. Did she remove her mother's vitriolic journal entries from those 7 months of silence after Beatrice announced her engagement to Prince Henry? It seems highly likely that she would have protected herself and her husband's memory from that painful record of her mother's disapproval. Whatever her motives, and they were likely a complex mix of all three, the result is the same. The Victoria we know from the journals is in large part a creation of Princess Beatrice. Her greatest act of service to her mother was to edit her, to smooth her rough edges, and to present a carefully polished version of her life to the world, even as she erased the primary source material forever. This monumental task was her constant companion as the 19th century drew to a close and the Queen's health began to fail. In January 1901, the royal family was summoned to Osborne House. The Queen was dying. Beatrice, who had spent nearly every day of her 43 years at her mother's side, barely left her room. She, along with her nephew, the German Emperor Wilhelm II, supported the dying monarch in her final hours.
She read to her, soothed her, and held her hand as the great Queen Empress and the era that bore her name slipped into history. On the evening of January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died. For the world, it was the end of an age. For Beatrice, it was the end of her entire world. The central organizing principle of her existence, the duty that had shaped her every decision from childhood, was gone. The mother she had loved and served so completely was no longer there. In that moment of profound grief, she was also, for the first time in her life, completely and utterly free. But what does freedom mean when you have never been taught how to use it? The aftermath of the Queen's death was a brutal shock for Beatrice. The somber, black-clad court she had always known vanished overnight. Her brother, now King Edward VIII, ushered in a new glittering and fast-paced era. The Edwardian age was one of lavish house parties, fast cars, and a more relaxed cosmopolitan society. Beatrice, the quiet, devout widow from a bygone age, had no real place in this new world. She was a living relic of the Victorian era, and her brother, while affectionate, had little time for the past. One of the first and most painful blows came with the fate of Osborne House. Beatrice, her mother, and her husband were all buried on the Isle of Wight. It was her sanctuary, the place she considered home. Victoria had intended for it to remain a private residence for the family, and Beatrice had been promised she could live there. But Edward VIII had always disliked the place. He swiftly decided to gift the main house to the nation, arguing that the crown already possessed more than enough royal residences, and the upkeep of Osborne was an unnecessary expense. Beatrice was devastated. It felt like an eviction, a severing of her last link to her mother and her husband. After a tense family negotiation, a compromise was reached. The king allowed her to keep her residence at Osborne Cottage, a smaller house on the estate, for her lifetime. It was a concession, but the message was clear. Her time at the center of the royal world was over. Adrift and without her lifelong purpose, Beatrice clung to the one great duty she had left, her mother's journals. This task, which had begun as a service, now became her salvation. It was her reason to get up in the morning. It was her way of continuing her relationship with her mother, of keeping her voice and presence alive. For the next 30 years, this project would be the central focus of her life. She was no longer the Queen's daughter or the Queen's companion. She had a new solitary role. She was the Queen's editor.
the high priestess of her mother's memory, guarding a legacy that she herself was meticulously crafting. In a world that was rushing headlong into the 20th century, Beatrice remained firmly in the 19th, surrounded by blue notebooks, ghosts, and the fading scent of her mother's ink. The dawn of the 20th century found Princess Beatrice a woman adrift. At 43 years old, she was for the first time without a defined role. The compass that had guided her every move for 4 decades. Her mother, Queen Victoria, was gone. Her new world was one of disorienting freedom and profound loneliness. Sidelined by her brother, the new King Edward VIII, and his glittering, fast-moving court, Beatrice retreated to the quiet seclusion of Osborne Cottage. There, surrounded by the ghosts of her mother and her husband, she faced a future she had never been expected to have. In this new, uncertain chapter, her focus narrowed to 2 all-consuming purposes: raising her 4 children and standing vigil over her mother's memory. Her children were her everything, the living embodiment of her 10 sunlit years with her beloved Leo. But even here, her joy was tempered by anxiety, and eventually by tragedy that would ripple across a continent.
Her eldest son, Alexander, known as Dro, pursued a distinguished military career, a path his father would have been proud of. But it was her only daughter, the beautiful and vivacious Victoria Uni, or Ina, who was destined for a grand but perilous future. In 1906, she captured the heart of King Alfonso XIII of Spain. It was a brilliant match, elevating a Battenberg princess to the throne of one of Europe's oldest monarchies. Beatrice traveled to Spain for the wedding, a rare and momentous trip. But the day of celebration, May 31st, 1906, turned into a scene of unimaginable horror. As the newly married couple processed through the streets of Madrid, an anarchist hidden in a balcony threw a bomb at their royal carriage. The explosion was devastating, killing dozens of bystanders and soldiers in the procession. Miraculously, Ina and Alonso were physically unharmed, though her beautiful white wedding dress was spattered with the blood of their guards. It was a brutal welcome to her new life, and a dark omen of the instability that would plague her husband's reign. But an even more insidious threat had traveled with Ina from England. Soon after the birth of her first son and heir, the Prince of Asturias, it was discovered that he had inherited Hämophilie, the royal disease, the genetic curse passed down from Queen Victoria, which Beatrice had carried and passed to her own sons, had now infected the Spanish royal line. This had catastrophic consequences. It placed an immense strain on Ina's marriage to the king, who could never forgive her for tainting the royal bloodline. It created a succession crisis and provided ammunition for those who sought to overthrow the monarchy. For Beatrice, watching from afar, it must have been an agony to see her own tragic genetic legacy play out on such a grand and public stage, causing her beloved daughter so much pain. This sense of inherited tragedy was to strike Beatrice again in the most direct and brutal way imaginable. In August 1914, the world plunged into the carnage of the First World War. The conflict tore Beatrice's extended family apart, pitting her British and German relatives against each other in the trenches. In 1917, amid a wave of intense anti-German sentiment in Britain, her nephew, King George V, made the historic decision to change the family name from the German Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the thoroughly English Windsor. At the same time, the Battenbergs were asked to relinquish their German titles. Beatrice's family adopted an anglicized version of their name, Mountbatten. Her eldest son, Alexander, became the Marquis of Carisbrooke. It was a symbolic severing of their German roots, a painful necessity of a world at war. But the war would demand a far greater sacrifice than just a name. All 3 of Beatrice's sons served in the conflict. Leopold was stationed in a staff role due to his hemophilia, and Alexander served throughout the war. But it was her youngest, Maurice, a bright, handsome, and charismatic lieutenant in the King's Royal Rifle Corps, who was sent to be her favorite. He was the child born after her hemophiliac son Leopold, and his robust health had been a source of immense relief. In October 1914, during the very first brutal months of the war, Maurice was leading his men in an advance during the First Battle of Ypres in Belgium when he was struck by an exploding shell. He was mortally wounded and died shortly after. He was just 23 years old. The news was a death blow to Beatrice's spirit. She had lost her husband to a colonial campaign, and now she had lost her youngest son to the mechanized slaughter of a world war. The pain was immeasurable, a grief so profound that those close to her said she never truly recovered. She had borne so much loss with quiet dignity, but the death of Maurice seemed to hollow her out, leaving a permanent void that would never be filled.
She had a private chapel dedicated to his memory at her home, and his name was the last she reportedly uttered on her own deathbed 30 years later. The years after the Great War were a long, quiet twilight for Princess Beatrice. She was now a figure from another time, a living link to the Victorian age in a world that had been irrevocably changed by war and revolution. She continued her solitary, monumental task of editing and transcribing her mother's journals, a project that took her 30 years to complete. This work was her anchor, her final act of service to the mother who had defined her life. In 1931, she saw the fruits of her labor into print, publishing a volume of extracts titled The Girlhood of Queen Victoria. The rest of her transcriptions remain in the Royal Archives at Windsor, the carefully curated version of a life, the original voice silenced forever. She lived a quiet, dignified life between her apartments at Kensington Palace and Bridge Park in Sussex. She doted on her grandchildren, a remote but loving matriarch. She was the last surviving child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, a fact that imbued her with a certain mystique. To see her was to see a piece of living history. She lived long enough to witness the abdication of her great-nephew Edward VII and the accession of his brother George VI. She lived to see the world plunge once again into a global conflict with the outbreak of the Second World War. She, who had been born in the era of muskets and cannonballs, lived to see the age of the Blitz and the atom bomb. On October 26, 1944, with the war still raging, Princess Beatrice died peacefully in her sleep at Bridge Park. She was 87 years old. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, a final gathering of the family she had served for so long. As per her final wishes, she was interred not at Windsor with the other royals, but in the small church at Whippingham on the Isle of Wight, laid to rest in the Battenberg Memorial Chapel beside her beloved husband Leo, finally reunited with the great love of her life nearly 50 years after his death. So, what is the lasting legacy of Princess Beatrice? Her story is not one of grand achievements, political triumphs, or public acclaim. Hers is a quieter, more complex, and perhaps more human legacy. Through her painstaking, if controversial work on Queen Victoria's journals, she became the primary gatekeeper to the Victorian age. She shaped our understanding of her mother, preserving a vast, invaluable record, even as she curated it, forever placing herself between the historian and the truth. Her life stands as the ultimate and perhaps most poignant example of Victorian filial duty and self-sacrifice. For decades, she surrendered her own freedom, her own ambitions, and her own desires to the needs of her mother. Was she a tragic, imprisoned figure? Or did she find a profound sense of purpose and meaning in that absolute devotion? The truth, as is so often the case, likely lies somewhere in the complex space between the two. Her story offers us a powerful, humanizing glimpse behind the velvet curtains of monarchy, revealing the immense personal costs that so often accompany a life of privilege and duty. Ultimately, Princess Beatrice's life was defined by love and by loss. The profound love she had for her mother, which shaped her youth, the passionate, life-changing love she had for her husband, which gave her a decade of happiness, the fierce, protective love she had for her children, which gave her purpose after his death, and the devastating losses she endured, of her husband, of her son, of her own autonomy, which she bore with a quiet, unshakable dignity that is in itself a powerful legacy. She was the baby of the family who outlived them all, the constant companion who became the final guardian of a legacy.
She was the shadow princess who spent her life in service to a great monarch, never realizing that her own quiet story of love, sacrifice, and endurance was in its own way just as compelling and just as unforgettable.